The golden hues of the setting sun stretched across the Sacramento skyline as Eric Porter drove home after a long day at the office. The soft hum of his sedan blended with the faint melody playing from the radio, a soothing backdrop against the evening bustle. He loosened his ties slightly, adjusting the air conditioning to shake off the residual stress of the day. As he neared an intersection, the traffic light flickered from yellow to red, prompting him to slow down and come to a halt. Just as he exhaled, a sudden burst of flashing blue and red lights reflected in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the piercing wail of a police siren. His brows furrowed slightly, but he remained composed. Pulling over to the side of the road, he rolled down his window, watching as a police cruiser stopped behind him. From it emerged a man in his mid-30s, Officer Bradley Larson, his badge gleaming under the dimming sunlight. With a buzz cut and the confident gait of someone used to being in control, Larson adjusted his belt and approached Eric's car. "License and registration," Larson commanded, his voice clipped and authoritative. Eric complied without hesitation, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He reached into the glove compartment, retrieved the requested documents, and handed them over. Larson's gaze bore into him, scrutinizing every detail as though searching for something more than just a routine traffic violation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, leaning slightly into the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied, his tone measured and respectful. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson stated, though there was the faintest hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned slightly before nodding. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Eric with renewed interest. Something about him made the officer pause, reconsidering whether this was simply a traffic stop or something more. His posture shifted subtly, his stance firming as though he had already decided this situation warranted deeper scrutiny. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson pressed, glancing at Eric's license. Eric hesitated for the briefest moment before replying. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. His questions took on an edge, a quiet but clear insinuation that Eric was more than just another driver on the road. The shift in his tone wasn't about the infraction anymore. It was something else, something that had little to do with the law and more to do with perception. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Eric's calm demeanor remained unwavering. "Just going home," he answered, his voice steady. But Larson wasn't convinced. His instincts, or perhaps his biases, told him that this stop was worth prolonging. And as Eric sat there, unwavering under the officer's scrutiny, he knew this was only the beginning. Officer Bradley Larson scrutinized Eric Porter with an intensity that went beyond a simple traffic stop. Something about Eric unsettled him, not in a way that suggested danger, but in a way that made him question why this man was so calm. Most drivers in this situation would have shown some nervousness, maybe fumbled with their documents, or stammered out an explanation. But Eric? He was composed, controlled, unshaken. That alone made Larson suspicious. The silence between them stretched as Larson held onto Eric's license and registration, flipping them over in his hands as though searching for something hidden in the ink. He had already decided that this was more than a routine stop. There was no obvious violation, no clear reason to escalate, but Larson's instincts, or perhaps something else, pushed him forward. "You seem awfully calm," Larson remarked, his voice carrying a faint trace of irritation. "Most people get a little anxious when they get pulled over." Eric met his gaze evenly. "I don't see a reason to be." Larson's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't like that answer. There was something about Eric's confidence that felt like a challenge, though Eric had done nothing overtly defiant. That, in itself, was the problem. People didn't just remain this calm when confronted by authority, unless they had experience with it. You seem pretty familiar with how this works, Larson continued, stepping back slightly but keeping his stance firm. Got something to hide? Eric exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. No, officer. Just believe in being clear about the reasons for interactions like this. Transparency, you know? Larson scoffed, his patience thinning. All right, step out of the car. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily, but his expression betrayed no reaction. Is there a specific reason for that, officer? His voice remained measured, firm but respectful. Larson's lips twitched, but he quickly masked the momentary lapse in control. I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be. There it was, the unspoken threat, hanging in the air like a wire pulled too taut. Eric had seen this before, too many times to count. It was never about the alleged violation. It was about control. But Eric wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated into submission. Still, he knew better than to argue. Without another word, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. Larson's eyes flicked over him, taking in the well-tailored suit, the polished shoes, details that didn't quite fit whatever profile Larson had created in his mind. Hands where I can see them, Larson ordered, motioning toward the front of the car. Eric complied, his movements slow and deliberate. Is there something specific you're looking for? Larson smirked faintly, though there was no real amusement behind it. Just routine, he said, patting Eric down. His hands lingered slightly longer than necessary, not just searching, but asserting. Still, Eric didn't flinch. His composure remained unshaken, which only seemed to frustrate Larson further. The officer stepped back, his expression hard. You're clean, he muttered, almost begrudgingly. Of course I am, Eric replied simply. But Larson wasn't done. He didn't want to be done. He had expected fear, submission, or at least some sign that Eric was rattled. Instead, he was met with unwavering control, and it made his skin crawl. Eric could see it clearly now. This wasn't about him breaking a law. It was about Larson trying to assert power where none was needed. And yet, Eric stood his ground, because he knew something Larson didn't. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension between Eric Porter and Officer Bradley Larson had reached its peak. Larson stood stiffly, his hand twitching near his belt as he tried to maintain the upper hand. He had spent his career reading people, deciding in seconds who was a threat and who wasn't. But Eric was different. He wasn't afraid, wasn't defensive, and most importantly, wasn't reacting the way Larson expected. Larson took a step closer, lowering his voice. You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Eric remained unmoved. I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made Larson bristle. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here. For a split second, Larson hesitated. His jaw clenched, his eyes flicking between Eric's steady expression and the document still tucked into his pocket. Then, without thinking, he spoke. People like you always... The words stopped short, but the damage was done. Eric's gaze sharpened. He had heard enough encounters like this to know exactly what Larson had meant. He didn't have to say the rest. The implication was clear. People like me, Eric repeated, his voice softer now, but charged with meaning. Larson stepped back, as if suddenly aware of how close he had let himself get to the edge. You know what I mean, he muttered, though he no longer sounded as sure of himself. Eric let the silence hang between them before exhaling. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his pocket. I'm reaching for my badge, he said, watching as Larson's shoulders tensed and his hand instinctively shifted toward his holster. No need for theatrics, Eric continued smoothly, pulling out a leather wallet and flipping it open. The gleaming badge inside caught the fading sunlight. Eric Porter, he said evenly, Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson's face drained of color. His gaze darted from the badge to Eric's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only quiet authority. Internal Affairs, Larson repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric nodded. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the badge you wear represents integrity and fairness. His tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the weight of his words. Larson swallowed hard. The shift in power was undeniable. What had begun as a simple traffic stop had just become the moment that could define his entire career. Eric Porter sat in his office the next morning, sunlight filtering through the blinds as he flipped open a file on his desk. The name on the front, Officer Bradley Larson. His fingers tapped lightly against the paper as he scanned the contents. Minor complaints. A pattern of excessive stops. Reports of misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Nothing serious enough to warrant termination, at least not in the eyes of those who had let it slide. That was the problem. Larson wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of something larger, a culture that allowed officers to act with unchecked authority, making assumptions about who deserved respect and who didn't. And last night, Larson had made the mistake of assuming Eric belonged in the latter category. A knock at the door pulled Eric from his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the reports from her. "Thanks, Linda." Then, after a pause, "Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, sensing the weight in his voice. "Of course." As she left, Eric turned back to Larson's file. This wasn't just about punishing one officer, it was about changing the system that enabled him. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in the conference room. The older man, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair, listened intently as Eric recounted the details of the traffic stop. When Eric finished, Daniels let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted, "but we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Eric replied, his voice firm. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening." Daniels studied him for a long moment. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, and our accountability systems. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You know you're going to ruffle some feathers with this." Eric didn't blink. "Good. It's about time someone did." Daniels exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "All right, Porter. Let's shake the tree." The process wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Eric felt like real change was possible. The following weeks were a whirlwind of investigations, meetings, and reform efforts. What had started as a routine traffic stop had evolved into a defining moment for the Sacramento Police Department. Eric Porter worked tirelessly, compiling reports, reviewing misconduct cases, and speaking with both officers and the public. The department-wide review he had proposed was no longer just an idea, it was in motion, and its impact was already being felt. Officer Bradley Larson, the man at the center of it all, faced an internal hearing. It wasn't just about his encounter with Eric, but about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. The hearing room was tense, the weight of scrutiny heavy in the air. Eric sat across from Larson, watching as the officer shifted uncomfortably under questioning. The same confidence he had displayed that night on the street was nowhere to be found. By the end of the proceedings, the ruling was clear. Larson would be suspended. It wasn't the harshest punishment, but it was a step in the right direction. More importantly, it set a precedent. Officers could no longer act with impunity, assuming their actions would be brushed under the rug. But for Eric, this wasn't about punishing one man. It was about fixing the system. He knew that Larson was just one of many officers who had internalized a dangerous mindset, one that allowed them to abuse their power under the guise of law enforcement. And he knew that punishing a single officer wouldn't prevent the next Larson from emerging. The real fight was against the culture that allowed this behavior to thrive. With the backing of Chief Daniels, Eric pushed forward with comprehensive policy changes. New de-escalation training was introduced, alongside stricter guidelines for traffic stops and officer conduct. A civilian oversight board was proposed to ensure transparency in future cases of misconduct. At the same time, Eric made a point to speak with officers directly. Not all of them were like Larson. Many were dedicated to serving their community with integrity, but even they acknowledged that accountability within the department had been lacking. Some resisted the changes, claiming they would make policing more difficult. But Eric stood firm. "This isn't about making your jobs harder," he told them during a department-wide meeting. "It's about making sure we're doing them right." As news of the reforms spread, public response was overwhelming. Community leaders who had long demanded change now saw real action being taken. Town hall meetings were held, where citizens voiced their concerns, and for the first time in years, they felt heard. Months later, Eric stood at the podium at a community event, addressing officers, city officials, and residents alike. The journey wasn't over, but progress had been made. "Justice isn't just about catching criminals," Eric said, his voice steady. "It's about ensuring that those entrusted with enforcing the law do so with integrity, fairness, and respect." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. Life teaches us that true strength does not come from authority or power, but from integrity and accountability. The story of Eric Porter reminds us that fairness and justice must not be optional. They must be the foundation of every action we take, especially for those in positions of power. For older generations, this lesson is particularly important. We have witnessed the consequences of unchecked authority, and we understand that real change comes not from silence, but from speaking up. Eric's ability to remain calm under pressure, to stand firm in his values, and to challenge a flawed system with wisdom rather than anger is something we can all learn from. In our own lives, whether in our families, communities, or workplaces, we must remember, respect is not something we demand, it is something we earn. When we hold others accountable with fairness and wisdom, we help shape a world where dignity is valued and justice is truly served. No matter our age, we all have a responsibility to stand for what is right. After all, the legacy we leave behind is not built on silence, but on the courage to act with honor, fairness, and respect.